There are literally billions of historical documents all around the world. Many of those have been collected by institutions for preservation because, of course, history deserves to be remembered. But collecting and storing and preserving such a huge number of documents, especially in a way that makes them accessible to researchers, offers unique challenges. And one solution has been the use of microforms, where images and documents are reduced in size, greatly reducing the amount of space needed to store them. But the use of microphotography technology has gone far beyond the storage of documents, and the practice is older than you might have thought. The history of microfilm deserves to be remembered. While there's evidence that the basic principles of photography were known well into antiquity, it wasn't until the 18th century that people began experimenting with ways to capture and fix images using light-sensitive material. The earliest efforts either failed or made very poor photographs, and it wasn't until the mid-1820s that Nicephore Niepce first fixed an image with a camera. His efforts required hours or even days of exposure, and what he produced was quite rudimentary. Louis Daguerre partnered with Niepce in 1829, but it wasn't until well after Niepce's death in 1833 that Daguerre developed the Daguerreotype process, which reduced the necessary exposure time to just minutes. Daguerre announced his process in 1839, shortly after William Henry Fox Talbot also announced his own process, which he'd been working on for years. Talbot's process was much slower and resembled some of the early works of Niepce. The daguerreotype, however, required less exposure and is considered the first practical photographic process. The invention of microphotography closely followed the invention of photography itself. John Benjamin Dancer, born in 1812, was an inventor with a broad array of interests who nonetheless patented rather few of his inventions. By 1835, he was in control of his father's instrument-making business in Liverpool and began experimenting with microphotography very shortly after the daguerreotype process was announced in 1839. He began producing photographs at this time and set up a developing and processing service. Dancer, who would help develop and produce microscopes, soon attached a microscopic lens to a camera to magnify the image. Ultimately, he was able to reduce images at a ratio of 160 to 1 and produce images of full pictures to as small as 1/16 of an inch. This process was much improved after Dancer began using the collodion process invented by Frederick Archer in 1851. His first microphotograph was of Sturgeon's tablet, an inscription in a church of a 680-word tablet erected in memory of electrician William Sturgeon in 1853. He gave away several copies to friends. He would reduce hundreds of images this way, from the Queen to Napoleon III to various abbeys, the Lord's Prayer, the imperial families of Russia and Austria, Windsor Castle, and many more. He exhibited some at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1861. Dancer sold his microphotographs as novelty slides with some success. Around 1870, Dancer began to lose his sight, likely either from diabetes or the result of glaucoma. His daughters, Eleanor Elizabeth and Catherine, would continue selling the miniature photos until they sold the business in 1900. But there was a wrinkle in the story of Dancer as the father of microphotography. Around 1857, George Shadbolt, a photographer and then editor of the Photographic Journal, invented an almost identical process of making extremely small photographs, and he and others claimed that Shadbolt was the originator of the practice. Dancer would argue with Shadbolt by sending letters to the editor and to the magazine. However, one of the Dancer's friends seemed to have made the biggest difference. When he sent to Shadbolt an image he claimed to have been made using Shadbolt's process. Shadbolt called the image an example of the excellent quality his method could produce. However, the slide was actually one of Dancer's 1853 images of William Sturgeon's tablet. The correspondence between Dancer and Shadbolt was read into the minutes of the Manchester Photographic Society. As one of those present said, "It is only due to our fellow member and townsman to set the public right as to who is the real discoverer of microphotography." There is a distinction between microphotography, the reducing of regular-sized images to incredibly minute size, and photomicrography, or the photography of incredibly small things using magnification such as microscopes. Dancer seems to have been interested in both of these pursuits, as well as general photography, including what are believed to be the earliest photographs of the city of Manchester. Dancer, however, does not seem to have considered his work in reducing the size of photos to be very important. He didn't document his processes, he didn't patent any kind of invention relating to them, or even particularly protect the images. The idea that microphotography was of little use was echoed in the 1858 Dictionary of Photography, which called the process somewhat trifling and childish. However, the practical applications of reducing photographs to microscopic size was soon apparent. As early as 1851, using microphotography as a means of preserving documents was suggested by astronomer James Gleicher, who saw microphotographs at the 1851 Great Exhibition in London. He called it the most remarkable discovery of modern times. In 1856 and 57, Sir David Brewster suggested using microfilm in espionage. In 1870, war broke out between the Second French Empire under Napoleon III and the North German Confederation, led by Prussia and Otto von Bismarck. By September, Prussian forces put Paris under siege. Normal communication lines were cut, and new methods of communicating with the outside world had to be tested. The French made use of balloons, but also of pigeons. Before the war, Parisian René Dagren began to experiment with minimizing photographs as well, and wrote a treatise on microscopic photography in 1864. Both Dancer and Dagren's work became used to decorate jewelry, but had to be viewed using microscopes, expensive devices. In 1857, Dagren solved this problem by mounting microphotographs at the end of a cylindrical lens. The lens was based on a Stanhope lens, a one-piece microscope invented by the 3rd Earl of Stanhope to create Stanhopes, or stanhoscopes. Dagren himself called them microscopic photo jewelry. They were mounted in rings and Stanhope balls and even violins, which could simply be viewed by bringing the lens up to your eye. Images included religious passages, famous paintings, paintings of royalty, and frequently erotic images. In 1859, he received the world's first patent for microfilm, and he began manufacturing Stanhopes in large numbers. By 1862, he employed 150 people and was making 12,000 Stanhopes a day. Dagren was also able to reduce the size even further, eventually fitting 130,400 letters on a microfilm frame, only half a millimeter square. Sending messages by pigeon was hampered by the fact that the messages must be short in order for the pigeon to be able to carry them. In the first month of the siege, a French politician escaped Paris in a balloon, and with the help of a local photographer, sent the first microphotographed message to Paris via pigeon. Soon all messages for Paris were printed in miniature. Dagren became involved slightly later, but his images were by far the best, able to be reduced to smaller sizes on lighter films. Using 15 square centimeters of light film, he could produce 12 to 16 folio pages of printing, containing some 3,000 dispatches. The method was so successful that soon the public was allowed to send messages to Paris on a cost-per-word basis. After the siege, Dagren sold souvenir cards containing minimized images. While microphotography continued to be used in the following decades, it remained largely a novelty, used to sell things like Dagren's Curiosities, which filled all manner of devices, and Dancer's Slides. The first American microfilm laboratory was opened in 1864, and microfilm trinkets traveled around the world. In 1876, they appeared in the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and 2 years later, Dagren received the silver medal at the Paris World's Fair. In 1887, the Century Company, a publisher of encyclopedias, microfilmed 25,000-page proofs to protect against damage and the greatest convenience in storage and handling. Thomas Edison got his name into the development as well by standardizing 35mm film, which became the standard size for microfilm as well as commercial movies. By 1900, a patent was issued for a bank check microfilming camera to store on microfilm countless checks that modern banks held on hand for fraud prevention and legal defense reasons. A similar machine patented in 1925 for a checograph machine was brought by the Eastman Kodak Company and marketed under their Recordac division. The development of the library and their growing size also led to calls for the use of microphotography. In 1858, the American Journal of Photography had imagined the usefulness of storing public documents on microfilm, writing that I trust that it will be the custom to make microscopic negatives of all valuable public documents. Photographic News wrote a year later that the whole archives of a nation might be packed away in a small snuff box. By 1906, librarians suggested it as a method of alleviating cost and space limitations of books. The 1920s saw a proliferation of this idea in practical use. The Library of Congress microfilmed more than 3 million pages of books and manuscripts from the British Library between 1927 and 1935, and in 1933 it began use to microformat dissertations. Print-on-demand services utilizing microfilm began at this time as well. And the possibilities of microfilm storage inspired H.G. Wells and others before him with the concept of a world brain, a synthetic and permanent world encyclopedia that could be accessed by all. Recordac began storing copies of the New York Times on microfilm in 1935, a method which was officially sanctioned by the American Library Association in 1936. University Microfilms International was established in 1938 and would dominate the field, which was becoming a part of ProQuest in 2001. Several kinds of microforms became common. Microfilm, which is stored as reels similar to film, microfiche, which are flat sheets stored as cards. By the 1960s, microfilming to store newspapers had become standard policy as a means of protecting deteriorating newspapers, as well as for better storage. Today, millions of newspapers are stored on microfilm and microfiche and can be accessed at libraries the world over, although much of that storage is being converted to the new space-saver digital copies. During World War II, microfilming as a method of communication again became a going concern, just as it had been during the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1930s, the Eastman Kodak Company, working with Imperial Airways and Pan American Airways, developed airgraphs as a method of reducing the weight and space of carrying mail. Standard airgraph forms were developed, which were photographed and mailed as negatives on microfilm, to be printed and delivered by Army Postal Service within the British military. Initially popular, the service was in use throughout the war. Based on the process, the U.S. developed their own program, Victory Mail, usually called V-Mail and officially called Photo Mail, as the primary method of communicating with soldiers abroad during the war. Mail between the front line and home was vital to morale. The 1942 annual report to the Postmaster General recognized that frequent and rapid communication with parents, associates, and other loved ones strengthens fortitude, enlivens patriotism, makes loneliness endurable, and inspires even greater devotion to the soldiers. More than 2.5 billion pieces of mail would be sent to the Army alone in 1945. Military personnel were sending an average of 6.04 pieces of mail each week. Launched on June 15, 1942, according to the National Postal Museum, V-Mail ensured that thousands of tons of shipping space could be reserved for war materials. The 37 mail bags required to carry 150,000 one-page letters could be replaced by a single mail sack. The weight of the same amount of mail was reduced dramatically from 2,575 pounds to a mere 45. On standardized lettered sheets, soldiers' letters would be censored and then minimized before being sent. Final prints were about 60% the size of the original. The prints also deterred espionage, as invisible ink, microdots, and microprinting wouldn't be reproduced in the photography. By 1944, the Army announced that V-Mail had saved 4,964,286 cargo pounds since its start, which could be used to transfer vital military supplies. The huge amount of documents created by the war and complex geopolitical situation after made microfilm an important tool of government. A 2018 issue of The Atlantic notes that as the war concluded in Europe, a coordinated effort by the U.S. Library of Congress and the U.S. State Department also put many international newspapers on microfilm as a way to better understand quickly changing geopolitical situations. In many cases, only the microfilm was retained. The Atlantic continued. By 1943, 400,000 pages had been transferred to microfilm by the U.S. National Archives alone, and the originals were destroyed. The data stored on microfilm, such a staple in spy stories, actually may have helped to spur the creation of the CIA, the Atlantic notes. Collecting and cataloging massive amounts of information in microscopic form from all over the world in one centralized location led to the idea of a centralized intelligence agency in 1947. Microfilm became a common tool of spycraft during the Cold War.
Microfilm, under a phony callus.
In 1950, strips of microfilm retrieved from a hollow pumpkin were used as evidence of espionage against State Department employee Alger Hiss. While the case is still a matter of controversy, the so-called pumpkin papers resulted in Hiss's conviction for perjury. Most of a century after its first use for the military during the Siege of Paris, a Soviet spy appeared in the same city to announce that he wished to defect to the West. His defection in 1957 would solve a 5-year-old mystery. In 1952, a newsboy had discovered a hollow nickel and found a tiny piece of paper inside that had rows of numbers. The FBI had been unable to decode the message, but the spy, named Reino Hayhanen, gave the FBI what they needed. This led to the capture of a compromised American soldier and a Soviet spy called William Fisher, who was jailed and later exchanged for captured American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers. In 1981, U.S. Navy ensign Stephen Anthony Baba pled guilty of trying to sell microfilm images of U.S. Navy codes to South Africa. Microfilm figured prominently in a 1986 case involving a Soviet spy network in Italy attempting to steal plans for a NATO jet fighter. One of the defendants was the director of a company that specialized in microfilm, who was, press reports say, caught in the act of handing microfilm containing NATO and Italian defense secrets to Soviet spies. In 1960, the National Microfilm Association of the United States of America gave a medal to Dancer's great-granddaughter for meritorious service to the microfilm industry. Microphotography, like that was used by Dancer and Daguerreotype, is pretty much a thing of the past, but there's still novelty companies that will sell these little items that you can look inside and see a little picture. And sometimes they're made by craftspeople. You can find them on Etsy. And as many as 60 million small items with stanhopes hidden inside were created after 1860, all the way into plastic ones that were made in the 1960s and 70s. You can find them fairly easily, say, on eBay. There hasn't really been a dedicated mail service for microfilm mail like V-Mail since the Second World War. And things, of course, can still go wrong. In 1978, motorcycle maker Harley-Davidson converted thousands of original renderings and designs dating from the company's founding through the mid-1970s to microfiche to save storage space. But the microfiche and the thousands of irreplaceable documents seems to have been lost, and only some 250 original documents saved by an employee and rediscovered in 2003 remain. Although digital storage is more popular in today's highly technological world, microfilm still has its uses, and you are still likely to find it in most libraries. Stored properly, it is very stable, difficult to damage, and easily reproducible. The website of the Denver Public Library notes, "Thanks to the high cost of digitization and the labor associated with indexing and scanning newspapers, most historic newspapers and documents are still available in just one format: microfilm." Polyester-based microfilm, developed by the Kodak Company in the 1990s, has a life expectancy before significant deterioration of more than half a millennium, ensuring that microfilm will continue to be a tool that preserves history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.